it's Crystal here from Speaking of Wildlife, and we are so excited to be joining you virtually for Barrie Winterfest. In this video series, you'll have an opportunity to meet some of Speaking of Wildlife's wildlife ambassadors, like Maverick the Wolf, who's joined me in this introduction. We'll give you an update on some of the animals that you met during Barrie's Canada Day celebrations in 2020, and we'll chat a little bit about winter adaptations, wildlife in your backyard, and we'll have some winter fun too. Now, before we get started, we always like to introduce the center and sort of what we do here. All of the animals that call Speaking of Wildlife home are with us because they cannot survive in the wild where they belong. Some of these animals were injured, orphaned, abandoned, others were illegally kept as pets, and in all cases, these animals cannot be released to the wild. So they'll live out the rest of their days with us, where we provide their essential needs like veterinary care, balanced diets, and enrichment, as well as specialized care for their individual needs, abilities, and of course their desires. We want to make sure they get some of their favorite things in there too. So with all of that information and that background for you, I think we better get started. So let's go. Today I'm joined by Larry the Virginia opossum. Larry was found when he was just a baby, and after not being able to reunite him with his mom and knowing he was too young to survive on his own, his finders brought him to a wildlife rehabilitation center. It was there that they did an exam and realized that something wasn't quite right about Larry. He was actually born without eyes. It's a condition called congenital anophthalmia and results in blindness. So we're not entirely sure what would have happened to Larry before he was found, whether he was separated from his family and just couldn't find them again, or whether he was abandoned because he wouldn't survive. But in any case, he's now with Speaking of Wildlife, where he can live safely and healthy despite his disabilities. Now, this might seem like a kind of strange animal for you to see in your backyard, and they might look a little silly not having any hair on their ears, their hands, or their tail. But these are an animal that are living right here in Ontario, and in fact, their range is expanding every year. Now, this range is expanding for a couple of reasons. One is that while they aren't equipped for cold winters, our winters are changing. They aren't quite as cold or as snowy as they once were. The other reason is that as they expand, we are also expanding. So we're actually providing some pretty easy things for them to utilize in order to survive the winter. So as opossums are becoming our wild neighbors, Larry is here to encourage you to love or at least respect thy neighbor. Our wild neighbors, such as opossums, skunks, and raccoons, and maybe some of the other animals you found in your backyard, can be quite opportunistic and can adapt fairly well to living in urban or populated areas. Now, chances are those wild animals were actually in your neighborhood before you were. They'd found resources, shelter, all the things they needed to survive there, and then when people moved in, we actually brought some more conveniences. We started building things like sheds, decks, and porches. We brought gardens and bird feeders and garbages, and those all, in some ways, make life a little easier for our wild neighbors. So in the case of opossums like Larry, who don't have any hair on their ears, their hands, or their tail, they actually need things like man-made structures in order to stay warm and survive the winters. So if you found yourself with an opossum or another one of those wild animals in your backyard, and you're feeling like you don't really want them there, we want to encourage you to think about a few things. The first is that the winter is not a great time for eviction. It can be really detrimental to the animal. It'd be hard for them to find a new place that provides all of those resources that they're finding in your yard. Not only that, but if the weather should change quickly, they'd be left without anywhere to go. So if you've got a resident living under your shed, your deck, or your porch, we encourage you to just leave them be for the winter. There are things, however, that you can do in the warmer months that would discourage an animal from making their homes there. The first is fairly simple. Make sure that your garbage, that your bird feeders, that all of those things are either tucked away or are very clean and aren't leaving scraps or food for them to get into. The other way is by making sure that all of those areas are sealed up, so there aren't any holes or gaps where animals could get in under your shed, your deck, or your porch. Now, if you do have an animal living in there, you can kind of take note of what animal that is, their patterns, make sure they don't have any babies, and when they leave for the day or the night, whenever they're active, you can simply close up the door. Now remember, we want to do this in the warmer months so they don't struggle as much to try to find a new place, because they won't have to combat the weather as well. Now there are some other things you could do just to deter them. Things like making sure it doesn't smell very nice or isn't appealing to them. So you want to put out something like maybe dog feces or maybe something stinky around the areas that you don't want them to use. Maybe a censored light would work as well. So all of those things will help to ensure that the animal doesn't feel safe or comfortable there and moves on maybe to another yard or to the forest where they belong. Now remember, we want to implement these things in the spring and summer in order to deter them in the fall and winter. We want to make sure that our animals are staying safe and healthy, and there's a good chance that they're just as afraid of you, if not more, than you are of them. So let's keep them safe, let's keep them warm this winter, and worry about moving them on in the spring and summer. All right, that's a wrap on this segment of our Barrie Winterfest video series. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to learn a little bit more about Speaking of Wildlife, feel free to check us out on Facebook or Instagram or at speakingofwildlife.ca. And until next time, take care.